So the theme of this year's CTP session is Cataloging Metadata and DEI, or DEIB, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. Today we have 3 great presentations. We will have all 3 presentations first and then questions and answers. I am pleased to introduce the speakers. The first speaker is Runxiao. Runxiao is the East Asian Studies Librarian and also a member of core reference in the instruction team at Oberlin College and Conservatory Libraries. At Oberlin, she works on the selection, acquisition, and bibliographic control of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean language collections. She is also actively involved with the digital initiatives team and works with special collection and visual resources, as well as archival collections. Runxiao is also a member of CEAL CTP and also Committee on Public Services. The second presenters are Jian Li and Keiko Hill. Jian Li is a Chinese cataloging and metadata librarian at the Tateuchi East Asia Library of University of Washington Libraries since 2019. Jian is responsible for original and enhanced cataloging of Chinese language materials in all formats, primarily print monographs. Before joining the University of Washington, Jian worked at the Ohio State University Libraries as the CJK cataloging coordinator. Jian earned her MLIS degree from Kent State University. Keiko Hill is a Japanese cataloger and Tateuchi East Asia Library serials and electronic resources librarian at the University of Washington since 2020. Her primary responsibility is to do original and enhanced cataloging of Japanese materials and to make them accessible to users. She is also responsible for cataloging serials and electronic resources in CJK languages. She is a member of the Critical Cataloging and Archival Description Working Group at the University of Washington Libraries. Our final speaker is Ryan Tamares. Ryan has worked for the Robert Crown Law Library at Stanford Law School since 2004. He has held the title of Head of Collection Services since 2016. Ryan oversees metadata processing and preservation of the library's collection. He also serves as a member of the library's DEI committee. On the national level, Ryan serves as liaison for the American Association of Law Libraries to the Committee on Cataloging, Description, and Access of the American Library Association.
So good afternoon, good morning, and everyone. And this presentation is an outcome of actually my library school research many years ago. So I want to say I'm no expert in Chinese classification system. There are many colleagues here have known much more than me. My intention is to bring a fruitful dialogue and to address the questions previously neglected or downplayed, and to be aware of the broad significance of our own field. My presentation originally examined the CV Star East Asian Library at Columbia University when I was first getting into East Asian libraryship as a graduate student assistant. However, after last week's catalog workshop, so I want to focus on how to look at classification system from very different perspectives. So by starting my talk on 2 quotes, one from Henry Blinks, the author of Blink's classification, quote, "The knowledge in the book as organized by its author is partly a product of his mind and partly drawn from sources beyond." The other from Edward Said in his famous Orientalism, quote, "Knowledge gives power, more power requires more knowledge, and so on in an increasing profitable dialectic of information and control," quote. This tells us the knowledge in the book has a structure which involves concept and assumptions. Language as one source of power, its transparency and authenticity can be very difficult to achieve. So the work of interpretation becomes very important and necessary. Classification not only helps us to organize the knowledge, but also provide a process of forming a hierarchical structure from the general to the specific, determining the similarity and the difference. This is very essential for us to understand dichotomy between organizing knowledges in a Chinese classification way and a non-Chinese classification way. Whether organizing knowledge in the Chinese way works for the North American Library or the Library Congress classification, or even Dewey Decimal classification are more suitable. Now let us look at the brief history of Chinese classification system. The first officially developed classification system in China was compiled by the father and the son, Liu Xiang and Liu Xin, during the Han Dynasty, 206 BC to 220 AD. Following the turbulent period of burning books executing Confucian scholar of the Qing Dynasty, the first emperor's dynasty, the more liberal Han Dynasty came to power and in promote of culture, books, and education. The father-son duo was appointed by Emperor Chengdi at 32 BC as official librarian in order to classify, cataloging the collection for the emperor, established the imperial library. Though the imperial court aggressively promotes the ideology of Confucianism, Liu Xin in particular has a very open mind about collecting and classifying not only Confucian books, but also other texts, commentaries by some pre-Qing period philosophy master on newly arrived the Buddhist texts, alchemy, yin-yang, or oral records and memoirs, etc. All those contribute to the classification system I want to introduce here. 七略, the seven epitome. The seven epitome include 易略, collective notes, 六易略, 6 classics, 诸子略, philosophical masters, 诗赋略, poetry, 兵书略, military art, 术士略, astrology, divination and mathematics, 方剂略, medicine and formulas. 7 epitome and its academic and cultural historical aspect reflect their contemporary thought at the time and the philosophical development during the Han Dynasty. About 120 years later, another great scholar named Ban Gu, 22 to 92 CE, composed annotated bibliographic in his famous Han Shu, the Book of Han. He incorporated the methods of Liu Xiang and Liu Xin's 7 epitome and used the Liu Fengfa 6 classics, regroup Liu's selection of books in Han Shu. The classification now including philosophy, poetry, military, divination, mathematics, and medicine. After several hundred years, so which I already showed here, there are a few national bibliographic compiled for the imperial collection of different dynasties, many of which were either lost or existed in a brief account, but nothing was significant as Liu's 7 epitome until the Jing Dynasty, Xun Xu. So Xun Xu here show he coined the fourfold system, 四部分类, in his book called the Zhongjing Xingbu. In this system, Xun reorganized all the material into 4 classes rather than 7 or 6, and marked each class with the Chinese cardinal number, 甲乙丙丁. The modification of Xun's bibliographic classification added a section of history as follows: 甲 including 6 classics, 乙 philosophical masts, military art, astrology, divination, mathematics, and medicine and the formula, 丙 including some of the 6 classics, history, state document, and the ding including poetry. This innovative classification system left its imprint on later bibliographics and imperial libraries for several dynasties, in particular Tang Dynasty. During the Tang Dynasty, the fourfold system have changed the class name from 甲乙丙丁 to 经史子集, and this newly named fourfold system continued to be used in many centuries. During the Qing, the last dynasty, Qing Emperor Qianlong's reign, the fourfold classification system was developed into a more complete scheme, which was often called the Four Treasures, 四库全书, This scheme was officially made under the initiation of Qianlong Emperor around 1735 to 1796 and took about 10 years from 1772 to 1782 CE to finish. In 4 treasures, 3,561 workers and 78,731 volumes were classified under 4 main classes and 44 divisions and 65 subdivisions. The 4 main class here I show as 经史子集, 经 classics 史, history, 子 philosophical master, and 集 collection of writings. After the Qing dynasty collapsed, the publication of the new Chinese material first in the late 19th century under the Western influence. The fourfold classification system based on the ancient school of CEAL have made it suitable for most of the Chinese literature as now facing new challenges. The Dewey Decimal Classification System was first introduced into the modern development of the Chinese classification system by the missionaries around the 1900s. The Dewey system was adopted by several Chinese university libraries at the time, generally to classify their foreign collections. Between 1920 to 1940, dozens of other new classification systems was introduced into China. In the 1960s, 中国图书馆图书分类法 classification for Chinese libraries was compiled and be widely used in China since then. The ideology and the political concerns for this classification system is to classify Chinese books based on Marxism, Leninism, and the Mao Zedong's ideology. So it is extremely important to remember how the cultural and historical foundation influenced the establishment of a classification system at one time period, and how the system have changed over time and the places. This help us to understand how the infamous Dewey Decimal System was introduced at the time, designed and implemented by Dewey. The general structure hierarchy of the Dewey Decimal is divided into classes, disciplines, and further by subject. Each of these classes is assigned with a specific number. Dewey Decimal System is a very popular system and is still widely used and throughout the English-speaking countries. And of course, the lens to look at the East and the other part of the world during the 19th century were very different from the present day. The Dewey Decimal is very Eurocentric. And for example, in the section of religion, Dewey uses 8 different disciplines on Christian-related subject, but squeeze paganism, Judaism, Islam, and any other new religion all into a section called other religion, and the number 290. We may all hear the controversial about namesake of Marvell Dewey Medal in 2019 by ALA as one of the founding father of ALA. Dewey Medal said it will be renamed to demonstrate the core value of ALA in equity, diversity, and inclusive due to Dewey's racial discrimination and the sexist remark during his tenure as New York State Library Director. Americans interested in the study of Chinese civilization and culture began earlier in the second half of the 19th century. Development of collection of Chinese material in American library began with the purchase of Caleb Cushion's Chinese Library by the Library of Congress in 1877. The most commonly adopted classification is the traditional 4 treasures at the time, shortly after LC's Chinese collection developed. They were considerably interested in collecting books in Chinese language in many other Chinese American library. In 1928, Alfred Qiu Kaiming was hired as the East Asian Library to work on the East Asian collection at the Harvard Yanjing Library. Originally from Ningbo, Qiu was the first librarian in the University of Amoy, present-day Xiamen. And under the guidance of Mary Elizabeth Wood, who established the first library school in China in 1920. Qiu was brought to study library science at the New York Public Library in 1924, then to Harvard. In 1943, Qiu published an article that introduced his new classification scheme, Harvard Yanjing classification system. Qiu used the 9 classes based on 4 treasures and many headings to the subclasses in the natural science and the social science, and humanity, agriculture, and the technology. So Chou's contribution to the classifications of Chinese material in the American library was a remarkable breakthrough. Beginning in 1958, many East Asian libraries in the US began to adopt the Library of Congress classification system and the newly developed subject heading. Consequently, the Library of Congress started to catalog classified Chinese material in the same way as Western collections. Eventually, the Library of Congress system replaced Chou's Harvard Yanjing system in the late 1970s. In the 80s, and the classification system, a classification of Chinese language library material has become increasingly standardized in line with general library practice. The standardization has affected both the bibliographic and the physical description of the material, as well as the subject analysis and the provision of subject and access. Having considered aspects of the classification of Chinese material within the content of American library, it is apparently the history of classification system in the China and the American content is very different. Now we look at a couple examples of the Library of Congress classification system. They are actually all English material I show here. First one, I was talking to one of the faculty last week, and she was telling me, and this book, it's called Suspended Music and the Chin Bells in the Culture of Bronze Age China. It was classed as a musical book in the Kong. And if you look at the table of content, it's have nothing to do, seems like, with its real content, which is archaeology in China. So the other example I want to show is Kaogongji. So Kaogongji, here you can see it's a translation of as ancient Chinese and encyclopedia of technology, and it's classed as a science book. We look here, Kaogongji, the text itself was compiling into Siku Quanshu as in the section of Jing, which is classics, and the subsection of right section and the Li Lei. So Kaogongji actually, it's not just about the science and the technology, it's more than that. But the LC classification system T27, which see earlier, only responds to the technology in general and the history and in Asia. So which we can see if text itself is cross-disciplinary, and in the Library of Congress classification system, it's very hard to show. The other good example is Tiangong Kaiwu. It's very similar. So is there a better classification system? To find a perfect classification system, it's very difficult to find a perfect classification system for a foreign language, even more difficult. Even though the Library of Congress classification system have been shown to be far more superior to other systems for now, the scheme used for the Chinese material needs to be revisited more often to embrace access and the retrievability. So Dewey Decimal System have been modified through years, yet still one of the most popular classifications in the world. We can't wipe Dewey out of the history book, neither can we diminish his accomplishment in our field. But to create more awareness and acknowledge of racial and sexist bias have to be done. Furthermore, why we need to embrace the progress of the modern classification system have been made in the last century. There are still much more we can do. I'm calling all the new generation catalogs and the field experts. We have a long journey ahead. I want to see us to embrace a more diverse culture and religious background in our field, and also to promote more diverse skill and expertise in our workforce to have everyone's voice heard. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Jen, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. My colleague and I today we will talk about EDI and anti-racism engagements at the UW libraries. Our presentation will be in two parts, EDI discussions that we had in the library, and also actions taken to address offensive and harmful languages in cataloging at the University of Washington libraries. To provide a little background, the UW Libraries is committed to EDI work. So equity is one of the library's core value. And to enhance equitable environments to afford search, learning, and working is one of our strategic goals. In the light of the Black Lives Matters movement in the summer of 2020, the UW Library Staff EDI Committee organized a series of Black Lives Matter Libraries Open Conversations and invited all libraries employees to open discussions and also to reflect on the protests and police brutalities across the US. So inspired by these conversations, smaller units also had EDI discussions, such as within the Tateuchi East Asia Library and the UW Libraries Cataloging Policies and Practice Committee. All these conversations accelerated the EDI work that, at the UW Libraries. And from July to December of 2020, the East Asia Library held monthly EDI discussions. We did readings and watched webinars on related EDI topics. And these topics were picked by individual staff members and also led by staff members, because not every staff members are working directly with EDI work. So sharing these discussions, having these discussions is a learning experience and helps to raise awareness, bias awareness, and EDI engagement in the workplace. And the UW Libraries Cataloging Policies and Practice Committee also hosted a series of discussions on cataloging ethics and critical cataloging. And these discussions were not only for catalogers, but also open to all library staff as well. And here are some highlights of the discussions that are related to cataloging work. There is a reoccurring theme on bias in the Library of Congress subject heading. So we recognize and acknowledge that historically and structurally, the LC classification system and the LC subject headings are biased, and the Library of Congress of the United States has the obligation to obey political mandates. Also, the LC subject heading are based on a literary warrant, which means they are based on the collections that were American-centric and Eurocentric. So some of these existing Library of Congress subheadings can be problematic and harmful as society changes. For example, like illegal aliens and Japanese Americans evacuation and relocation, 1942 to 1945. So when we catalog, we need to be more critical on choosing subject headings. And if we identify problematic subject headings, we need to report them. There's a system in place to propose new and revise existing subject headings, such as through the CEAL program. Though the process can be slow and may always not be approved because the system itself is complex and bureaucratic. Oh, sorry. And we also talk about alternative vocabularies, like local subject headings and other control vocabularies, such as homosaurus for LGBTQ terms. And we also discuss about like who decides which term terminology is acceptable. Preferred terms change over time. So like American Indians, First Nations is the preferred term for indigenous people in Canada, but might not be in the US. So overall, eliminating offensive and harmful language in bibliographic descriptions is a collaborative work, and catalogers alone cannot make this happen. So we need buy-in and support from the institution and collaboration with stakeholders within the institution consortium, like nationally or internationally. And ethical concern in the name authority records is another big controversial topic. So name authority records are created to facilitate searching and browsing, by the NACO participants, and the records are maintained by the LC in the LC name authority file. These records are open access and readily available on the internet publicly. So, and a name authority record may contain information such as preferred name, variant names, gender, birthday, and etc. So we need to consider how much information is too much when we are creating an authority record, and be mindful of the impact it might have on the authors. Recording information such as real identity, gender, and birthday may also cause privacy issues. One example from the book is that some zine creators use pseudonyms, but sometimes a name authority record can expose their real identity by recording their legal names, which may pose danger or unwanted attention for them. Same as gender and birthdays. And one solution that we talked about is to ask for consent. And this may pose more work on the cataloger, and authors may not always respond. Also, it's hard to find contact information, especially for international authors. Okay. So having this EDI discussions create a momentum and urgency to put EDI work into action. And before the Library of Congress revised the term illegal aliens with alternative terms, the UW libraries make efforts to do so locally. The UW Libraries is part of the Orbis Cascade Alliance Consortium. Replacing the term in our shared iOS system is a consortial effort. In November 2019, the Alliance Catalaging Standing Group had a discussion paper on replacing illegal aliens with alternatives. No actions were taken until June 2020. The group wrote a recommendation to implement the change. Then later in this September, the Alliance Council approved the recommendation. The Alliance Norm Rule Standing Group, responsible for the display of Primo, our online catalog, did experiments and successfully implemented the change in January of 2021. And now I will hand it over to Keiko.
Great, thank you, Jen. So can you put the process?
Okay. Sorry.
Right. The University of Washington Libraries drafted the critical cataloging and archival description statement in spring 2021 and published it on the library website in summer 2021. This is a web page that shows a part of it. It is under community engagement of the University of Washington's EDIA page. The statement states that cataloging and archival description provides essential information to enable users to discover and access our resources. As we acknowledge that our profession and workplace have never been and are not neutral, as well as our collections and our professional practices as librarians and archivists are not neutral, we are committed to taking a critical approach when making decisions to choose the languages to describe library resources. Next slide, please. Creating and publishing the statement is a collaboration work done by an ad hoc working group. Initially a member of Catalaging and metadata services at the University of Washington Libraries, who was also a chair of Alliance Working Group, Catalaging Standing Group, and another member from Special Collections, who is chair of Alliance Unique and Local Content Team, discussed creating the statement in summer 2020. Alliance Catalaging Standing Group had been working on recommendation on implementing Alliance-wide alternative to the Library of Congress subject heading illegal alien subject terminology since 2019. Those two members brought the idea of the statement back to each department and called for volunteers to work on the statement. As a result, The working group was formed in winter 2021 with members coming from 3 different departments of the libraries. The group met monthly over Zoom and discussed what should be included in the statement, where the statement should be published, the mechanism of user feedback, and internal workflow for each department. The group also asked feedback from their own department during the process. Next slide, please. Why the critical librarianship and implementing it in our descriptive work is important in EDI was discussed. Critical librarianship is that we acknowledge that the libraries and archives are not neutral, and our practices are influenced by society and culture. And every librarian and archivist brings their own biases consciously or subconsciously. That means that the language we use for describes and correction is impacted by our own perspective. Our goal in implementing the critical librarianship and archival practice is to be more transparent and accountable in how we describe our materials. Taking a critical approach to descriptive practices means we question status quo and seek alternative control vocabularies and ways of organizing knowledge, more inclusive and equitable. Next slide, please. The statement seeks to acknowledge that cataloging and archival description have never been neutral. We commit to address harmful language in our catalog records, finding aids, and other metadata records. Also, we explain the limitations. Sometimes we can do a little or nothing on request. We have more control on MARC records in OCLC and consortial implementation in ALMA and then in Primo. However, changing Library of Congress subject heading may be lengthy, not always successful, and may be impacted by external parties. And we don't have control over knowledge-based records provided by ex-libris and publishers. We also express the cases that we retain problematic language in archival description. It is because the description was provided by the creator, and we think it's important to understand the historical context, and we don't want to conceal that either. Next slide, please. The goal of the critical cataloging and archival description is to bring critical librarianship into our descriptive work and make our descriptive resources more inclusive and reduce harm by repairing problematic descriptions, also increasing transparency to our users. Next slide, please. We developed several mechanisms to ensure users find a way to alert us. One is a Google feedback form. The other is sending requests to our working group email account. The last is we create Live Answers account so that when users contact via Ask Us, the responder can direct user request to working group, and we are able to communicate with the requester through Live Answers. Next slide, please. This is a Google feedback form that users use for requests. Feedback form asking, link to specific catalog record, archival finding aid, or digital corrections page, so that we are able to find it. Title of name, correction, or item, or material, brief description of the issue, suggestions for alternative terminology or wording. If this request is from internal or not, confirm if the requester needs follow-up or not. Next slide, please. You can see this issue here in the back-end tracking spreadsheet, auto-generated from the Google form, which also includes several columns for additional notes, including which working group member took on the case, any notes about remediation decisions, and if the issue has been resolved. This case is a request from a library staff who noticed that finding aid and catalog record to Cardwell as Negro, and it was changed to African American. Next slide, please. Promotion for the statement is next step we did after the statement was published. We wrote an article about the statement and published it in the University of Washington Library's blog. The soon to be published TEAL East Asia Library quarterly newsletter also includes the article. Also, we announced it on our Facebook pages. Unless we have feedback from users, the statement is going to be less effective. Next slide, please. We thought that subject specialists need to get looped in when issues pertain to a specific subject area. So we had 2 presentations for promotion in February 2022. One is for librarians of University of Washington at the Association of Librarians of University of Washington quarterly meeting. And another is a library-wide forum for all library staff. Information school faculty and students joined the forum as well. This is a slide we used for the presentation for ALUW. We wanted to promote a statement to all librarians to flag an issue, not only from users. Next slide, please. As of today, we have 4 feedbacks so far. Our next step is to make the statement and the ability to submit feedback will be more visible to users. We hope that after Primo VE migration is completed this summer, the icon that links you to the statement along with a feedback form will be displayed in Primo catalog records. I believe we must continue to promote the statement to wider communities at the University of Washington. Also, as TEAL East Asia Library, what can we do for the promotion? I think that hearing the voices from the users who use the TEAL East Asia Library collection is valuable, particularly to East Asian communities as well. And I hope to receive more feedback from them. Next slide. This is a list of resources. The last slide. Thank you very much.
Can everybody hear me and see the screen share?
Yes.
Great. So as a reminder, I'm here presenting from the Robert Crown Law Library at Stanford. And I would like to give a big thank you to Mieko Matza for connecting me with CEAL. So I think one of the first things we can really do when working with a DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging issues is to talk about it. It's a big first step. And to this end, our library's DEI committee hosted virtual events in 2021. Our DEI committee organized a panel discussion focused on law students open to the law school community regarding the documentary Change the Subject on April 7, 2021. Now in context, this event was scheduled months before the November 2021 Library of Congress announcement moving forward to cancel the LC subject heading illegal aliens and replace with non-citizens and illegal immigration. In case you have not seen it, the film is about a group of Dartmouth students who challenged anti-immigrant language in the Library of Congress subject headings. Their advocacy took them all the way from the Baker Berry Library to the halls of Congress, showing how an instance of campus activism entered the national spotlight and how a cataloging term became a flashpoint in the immigration debate on Capitol Hill. Our panel featured one of the filmmakers involved in the movement, Oscar Ruben Cornejo Caceres, and Stanford librarians Nancy Lorimer, Ann Myers, and myself, with moderator and law librarian reference colleague Grace Lowe. During the panel, there were 4 questions asked of each panelist, and I will share with you the answers I provided. The first question was, how did you first learn about this issue, and how did it impact your own work? I first learned of this issue from discussions at the American Association of Law Libraries, AALL meetings. I then began gathering information from AALL colleagues who have undertaken this type of project, and using that information, brought a proposal for the problematic illegal aliens Library of Congress subject headings to the main libraries group for the law library. The second question what was your thought process in considering alternative terms to propose to the Library of Congress and or implement at Stanford? And what do you think of the Library of Congress's announced replacements of non-citizen and unauthorized immigration? My response, because LCSH is a controlled vocabulary, I had to find out how other institutions were approaching this project. And that's how I arrived at the process I described earlier. Because of the years of the inability of LC to appropriately replace the problematic subject headings, I have primarily been focusing on what can be accomplished, especially locally. The third question. The Biden administration has announced efforts to drop the term illegal aliens from its own usage and from US laws more broadly. Do you think this will help the Library of Congress and other libraries around the country move forward with making similar changes? My response was twofold. First, I have had email conversations with my AALL colleague, Kate Kellett, who is our AALL liaison to the ALA Subject Analysis Committee, or SAC. On this topic of the Biden administration's announcements, she said this: at the SAC midwinter virtual meetings, there was a question on how the executive office is pushing a change in language. The response seemed to be that it's definitely a plus, but since it's not Congress, it's not as influential as it seems. But since the makeup of Congress has changed so much, it's definitely more likely they'll be able to make controversial changes more quickly. Of course, the LC liaison couldn't say anything like that. It was more of a general consensus of the committee. However, there is also this. SAC decided to keep the working group as is. That is the SAC Advisory Group on Alternatives to LCSH, Illegal Aliens, making it clear that the same workflows could be used for future problematic headings. So this is the commitment for further work in updating LCSH. The final question I answered for the panel is, what else would you like to see changed in library systems? I had 3 points for this response. First, continue supporting awareness about problems and descriptions such as inappropriate and or outdated descriptions through programs such as these. That also includes our program today. Number 2, continue to improve and streamline the processes of updating descriptors, also known as subject headings and other areas of description. And 3, improve recruitment and retention of librarians to cataloging and metadata positions. For the next event that our library held, it was an internal library event, a film screening and discussion of Patsy Mink, ahead of the majority on April 23, 2021. The film details the remarkable political journey of an Asian American woman who battled racism and sexism, shattered barriers, and redefined American politics. In 1965, Patsy Takemoto Mink became the first woman of color in the United States Congress. 7 years later, she ran for US president and co-authored Title IX, the landmark legislation that opened up higher education and athletics to America's women. As an aside, this year marks the 50th anniversary of Title IX. The big takeaway from the event for myself and my DEI committee colleagues was be prepared for possibly difficult conversations. Be prepared with techniques to diffuse tense conversations. Fortunately, that didn't happen during the event, but I think they were perfectly prepared for in case that would have happened. Metadata is important to update as a vein of DEIB work. As one example, Stanford University libraries work with campus libraries, including our library, to update LC subject cutters for Blacks. For example, LC call number D547 and 4 Negroes in World War I, replaced by D547 B64, Blacks in World War II, of which our library had a small number. This was undertaken per LC decision in 2021 to cancel 40 cutters and replace cutters representing the word blacks. Our library made an update for LC subclass numbers E18406 to E184A75 for Asian Americans. Although the updated class number has existed for a while, the change had not been applied to some titles. Some of our future work will be to examine social science LC class schedules and H for possible updates to subject cutters, as I mentioned in the two examples before. Another example of metadata work is updating titles to utilize the new tribal and indigenous law schedules. For example, this tribal law casebook, the second edition is classed in KIE 110. The first edition was originally at KF 8205. The former KF call numbers conflated tribal and indigenous law with US law classifications related to relations with Native American tribes. Our current policy is to update older editions with latest call numbers, as well as perform original cataloging utilizing the tribal and indigenous law schedules, that is KI through KIR. In summary, these are a few examples of the kind of work in DEIB we have done at my library and plan to do so in the future. Any questions for myself and my other co-presenters?